In his powerful 1984 article, Permission to Narrate, Edward Said said, "The Palestinian narrative has never been officially admitted to Israeli history, except as that of non-Jews, whose inert presence in Palestine was a nuisance to be ignored or expelled." Said used the word inert, of course, not descriptively, but to conjure up the Zionist fantasy of the ideal Palestinian body. Perhaps for the colonizer, this ideal body should be lifeless or disappeared. But given the stubborn persistence of Palestinians to remain living on their own land, they should cause as little disturbance to the colonizers as possible. Along with no displays of cultural identity, there must be no passion, no pride, no joy, no sorrow, no anger, indeed, no demonstrable emotions that might trouble their oppressors. The late Palestinian psychologist Adib Jarrah, referring to the narcissism which characterized so much Israeli discourse about Palestinians, said in 2016, "We must be the only oppressed people whose job it is to make our oppressors feel good about themselves." His words were revived when Israel issued a diktat that in the first exchanges of prisoners as part of the current Gaza ceasefire, Palestinians welcoming back their loved ones must not demonstrate any public joy or celebration. These orders were reinforced by soldiers arriving at the family homes of those about to be released. Most prisoners released in the first round were women subject to illegal carceration, and they were held until it was dark. Needless to say, they were greeted with exuberant joy by all those who waited up for their return. We should pause and ask the question, what does this attempted prohibition of public joy signify? It stands in stark contrast to the public outpouring of emotion that greeted the release of Israeli captives. It reflects narcissism, a sense of entitlement, and a belief that only the feelings of Jewish Israeli citizens matter. This is reinforced by the impunity granted to Israel by Western governments to consider only its own needs and interests. It is mirrored by mainstream media that covers the suffering of Israeli captives and their families in detail, elaborating their individual narratives, always referring to them by name, while Palestinians held in Israeli jails are mostly portrayed as an inchoate mass with individual stories rarely attached. For example, the New York Times has published extensive human interest stories about the released female Israeli soldiers, but failed to cover in any detail the detention of the heroic Dr. Hussam Abu Safia. This focus on Israeli Jewish feelings alone has been and continues to be replicated in the demand that anyone speaking about Palestinian suffering must first condemn the Hamas attacks of 7th of October 2023. That day has been subject to continual coverage on Israeli media, amplifying a sense of fear and victimhood and reinforcing a shocking indifference to the genocide being waged less than 80 kilometers from Tel Aviv. Author Naomi Klein referred to this as the weaponization of trauma, arguing that the state of shock from 7 October is maintained so that people are kept in a state of raw emotion that precludes any possibility for empathy, thoughtful analysis, guilt or shame about the genocidal campaign taking place supposedly in their name. The obverse of this hyper-emotionality is the refusal to accept that Palestinians are entitled to any emotional display, and to label such displays as a threat, as disruptive, as inimical to the public good. It fits with a pattern of surveillance, not only over the movement's activity and speech of Palestinians, but also over their emotions. Policing of emotions is another aspect of the deep intrusion of a settler colonial state into the subject people. For example, Palestinians held up for hours at checkpoints cannot express frustration by shouting or hooting their horns, as they will be punished. Feelings of rage and fury thus have to be suppressed. These emotional experiences are mirrored in the way that Palestinians speaking to the Western media often feel they have to measure every word so they don't come across too forcefully or emotionally and risk alienating their interviewer or conforming to colonizing tropes of the over-emotional, irrational native, so well analysed by Said in his book Orientalism. Public displays of emotion, whether joy at the release of prisoners or grief at the burial of martyrs, are policed in multiple ways. Israel has long had a practice of refusing to return the bodies of Palestinians subjected to extrajudicial killing, invariably accused of terrorism, but assassinated before they had a chance to stand trial. In these cases, the body is often held as a bargaining chip and a means of control. Former Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Yaalon admitted in 2015 to refusing to return the bodies of slain Palestinians unless their funerals were kept as modest family affairs held at night. He threatened that when this does not happen, we will not return them, even if it means us burying them ourselves. The distress caused to Palestinian families by having to bury their loved ones under such imposed conditions is compounded by an inability to perform Muslim burial rituals and the very poor state of a body that has been deep frozen for weeks. But expressions of distress or anger aroused by these intolerable conditions are seen by those of power only as a political threat or as promoting violence against Israelis. One of the most egregious examples of disrupting public grief took place in 2022 in occupied East Jerusalem at the funeral of Shireen Abu Akleh, the renowned Al Jazeera journalist. Israeli soldiers attacked the pallbearers, almost causing her casket to fall to the ground. The fact that they saw fit to do this at the funeral of a woman, an iconic figure beloved by millions in the Arab world, and moreover killed by an Israeli soldier, indicates how little Israel and the US care about causing hurt or offence to Arab public opinion. Emotions, to quote Said's comment about facts, do not at all speak for themselves, but require a socially acceptable narrative to absorb, sustain, and circulate them. How emotions are narrativized is a function of power, and in a context of extreme power imbalance, only the emotions of those with power are allowed to count. Thousands of Palestinian scholars, journalists, activists, poets, and novelists have shared the historical narratives forming the contemporary Palestinian experience, and thereby placed actions and emotions, including those of the Hamas attacks of 7 October, in an explicable context. But the refusal of Israel and its defenders to connect Palestinian actions to any history or context, alongside a construction of all resistance as terrorism, is a sterile and repetitive practice of power. The obsessive need to police emotions is one such practice, ultimately a sign of weakness and vulnerability. On the first day of the Gaza ceasefire, 3 young Israeli women emerged from captivity into the light to expressions of joy that few would begrudge them or their families. In the middle of that night, 90 Palestinian women and children emerged from the darkness of their captivity, but they were not intended to emerge into a jubilant, joyful light. The occupying power preferred to keep them in the dark, conjuring up former Chief of Staff Raphael Eitan's vile phrase from 1982, like drugged roaches in a bottle. The attempt to suppress displays of emotion that challenge the oppressors must be seen for what it is, and always has been, a deeply racist and dehumanising worldview. The families of the released detainees refused this dehumanisation and insisted on celebrating. This can be seen as an act of resistance. However, the word resistance conveys reactivity to oppression and accords therefore too much power to the oppressor. Far more than resistance, it is an insistence upon the right to life, livability, and the freedom to give voice to all human emotions, whether joy, anger, sorrow, or pride.